Oh, we have no sound.
Raymond, at least I hear you, so you may try to start.
Oh, okay, good morning. Yeah, there was, this is already the first, let's say, issue which became a bit problematic. There was a sound for this trailer. So that's the reason why, in fact, nobody was talking. So probably on the YouTube, the sound in this case was visible. So ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, distinguished panelists, dear friends, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this first seminar and this first webinar in the European and Central Asia region related to COVID. I'm welcoming not only you on the Zoom feature, but also live stream on the YouTube. The specific feature of the Zoom webinar will result in the fact that you can see the panelists, but you cannot see also yourself or the rest of the audience. So this is the information which I'm passing on to the audience. So don't worry if you will not appear on this main board. This allows you still as an audience to have the panelists very prominently displayed throughout the session, but you can also fully engage with questions to the panelists. We will also use throughout the session a so-called spotlight function to put the relevant speakers in the center of the attention while they are also speaking. So you should, in fact, at the moment, see myself in this case, also in the spotlight. We have a team in the back which is collecting also the questions, which looks at your questions. And so I really want to encourage you as an audience, both on the Zoom as well as also on the YouTube channel, that you post your questions, you post your comments. We will, in principle, select some of them and we will bring them in to the panelists. In case you have any kind of problems on the Zoom or of course also on the YouTube, so please use also the chat functions and the colleague would also be ready to help you. So this was just some of the, I would say, maintenance and some of the housekeeping in order to get also started. Let's come, I think, more to the technical part. Lifting the lockdowns, what next for the food system? I think it's a pertinent question. And in the past months, we have seen how the countries of the region have moved into restrictions, closing shops, closing school, maintaining social distance. And we have also seen the implication on the food value chains, but they were not as severe as initially predicted for the region. Now the lockdown is easing up and the countries are lifting the measures slowly with social distances in place and also protection gear for rural workers, processing facilities, etc. However, the economic implications are about to come. The EU has released, for example, yesterday, an information about the potential recovery package and also the implication it has on households and businesses. So what comes next after this lockdown and what comes next, particularly for the food systems? What does it mean for production, processing, trade, but also for the rural areas? So what are the measures we can put in place in order to minimize further the implications? I think this is something we really need to talk about, and it's the center of the topic with the speakers we have invited today also for these meetings. And I'm very happy in this case to welcome amongst the panel speakers, first Vladimir Olegovich Rachmanin, Assistant Director General and FAO Regional Representative for Europe and Central Asia. He will address us with his opening remark quite soon. I'm very happy to see also Maximo Torero, Assistant Director General and Chief Economist of FAO. Maximo's service and the unit and the department is the key division behind the series of policy briefs which the organization has produced in the past weeks. But we do not have certainly only FAO, but we really want to hear of course, also from the countries in the region, also from the private sector. And so we really want to know what is the situation and what is going to come next. And for this, we have the pleasure to have Armen Kochoyan, who is the Deputy Minister of Economy of Armenia. Armen is an economist by training and in his current position since early this year. So he has been in the middle of or at the beginning of the crisis, been put in this position, which I think is a very demanding situation. Of course, we also want to see how the situation is in Georgia. And we have invited for this Katya Tsilosani, the Deputy Minister of Environmental Protection and Agriculture from Georgia. Welcome also to this panel, Katya. And we have, of course, also Ukraine. Ukraine is one of the countries which is quite significant in terms of the agriculture export, not just in the region, but also globally. And I'm very happy to welcome Taras Kachka, the Deputy Minister for Economic Development, Trade and Agriculture of Ukraine. He's also the trade representative of Ukraine. And last, but of course also not least, we want to hear also from, let's say, the private sector, from the producers. And for this, we have invited Paolo Guglievaya, the Chief Policy Advisor of Copea Cogeca Brussels. And he's representing, of course, a large number of farmer organizations and processing enterprises in the region. So I'm very, very happy to welcome you on this panel. And we are, of course, also welcome very much Tugomir Majdak. He's the State Secretary from the Ministry of Agriculture of Croatia. And in that sense, I'm certainly also very pleased because we have also an EU member country amongst our panel. So we have, in fact, quite an interesting composition also of the countries in order to get a good understanding. So let's get started. And in this case, I would like to give the floor to Vladimir Legovich to start. Vladimir, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Raymond, and colleagues. First of all, distinguished panelists, dear friends, colleagues, I'm happy to count the number of participants, which is now in my screen 278. And I'm sorry that the Russian translation is not very audible, but I believe we can fix it. Доброе утро всем русскоговорящим. Я тоже вижу, что среди участников достаточно много людей, говорящих по-русски. Доброе утро, добро пожаловать. So it's an honor for me and a pleasure also to open up this webinar, which is the first in the series which we are planning to share with you and exchange opinions. Since the start of the pandemic, we're in FAO been in constant contact with the governments, civil society organizations, private companies, monitoring situation in the region in order to see how best to avoid negative impact of this pandemic on agriculture and food security. For these purposes, we are conducting surveys for the region of Europe and Central Asia with the involvement of more than 450 respondents from the food value chain from 14 countries, including farm input suppliers, farmers, food manufacturers, wholesalers, and retailers in the region. Based on these surveys from the field, we identified a number of issues which the farmers and the governments were coming across during these unprecedented and very uncertain times. They are different, starting with disruptions because of the logistics, border closures, then inability of the farmers to get to the markets, inability for the farmers to sell to tourists, to tourism sector, which was locking down, the difficulties on the processing farms and on the processing facilities with avoiding the infection, very different issues which were related to this pandemic. We had also a number of targeted consultations with the ministers in the region. And I'm happy to see Tugomir here with us from Croatia, because yesterday we have a discussion on this topic with Western Balkans ministers of agriculture. And I'm glad to confirm that the efforts of the governments were overall efficient and prevented worst case scenarios in our region. Sometimes I feel that I'm wrong to be pessimistic, because the input from the field was fairly stable. But I was always confirming that the situation with food security, agriculture is fairly stable in our region in comparison with our other parts of the world. But this is the achievement of the governments, achievement of the private companies, all the farmers who continue to produce and put the food on the table of the people. But we cannot afford to be complacent, especially in the uncertainties about virus spread and the economic crisis, which was initiated by the pandemic. And we feel the consequences in the midterm, and we need to be prepared for that. We believe that it's very important to coordinate our efforts, to learn from each other, and to share best practices. We also believe that crisis is providing us with the opportunities to transform agriculture, to build sustainable food systems for the future. Raymond mentioned the budget discussion in Brussels yesterday, which was very brave and very forthcoming, strategic. But I also want to mention two strategies with European Union introduced in the last days. And this is biodiversity strategy and strategy from farm to fork, which is focusing specifically on sustainable food systems and having a very strong international dimension as well. We know that in other parts, in the eastern parts of our constituency, there are also strategic approaches being developed regarding the agriculture. And this is very important, because I hope that our discussions will contribute to facing challenges with innovative and correct approaches, to using opportunities instead of only overcoming threats. I believe we have this opportunity, and FAO, as the technical organization of United Nations, is very much committed to sustainable development goals, to the Agenda 2030, working with other UN organizations. We need to keep it in focus. And I also want to use this opportunity in conclusion to express my gratitude to our chief economists who are joining us today, Massimo Tarrera, who from the very first moment of this pandemic developing was leading the FAO assessment approaches, contributing not only to the global issues, but also to our country work within UN country teams, developing methodology and very practical, pragmatic, no-nonsense approaches. So I'm looking forward to his presentation also for our region. So the combination of our joint efforts, governments, civil society, private sector, just assisted in overcoming the, as I say, worst case scenarios, but we need to be vigilant and we need to try to use this opportunity in order to build the better future for agriculture. So I'm looking forward to all our discussions today and forthcoming, and looking forward to all your suggestions, advices, and best practices. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to our fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Vladimir Olegovich. I think the forward-looking and particular using opportunities, I think will be something which will be very good, handing over to Massimo Torero, Chief Economist. So Massimo, the floor is yours to give us a bit insight in how you see the situation and what are maybe things are coming next for the food system after lifting the lockdown. The floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you very much to both of you and Vladimir for your kind words. So what we are trying to do today is trying to put in context how the situation will be looking forward. And the way we at FAO is doing that is basically dividing the process in phases. So we had the first phase of COVID-19, which we call the containment phase, which was the phase of the lockdowns, the phase which we are moving out. And that phase created significant logistical problems, especially in commodities of food. The logistical problems were lower in staple commodities because they are more capital intensive and they are less perishable, of course, relative to high value commodities, which of course, because of their perishability and because the labor intensity were severely affected in terms of access to labor, not only because of lockdowns, but also because of health. Despite that, just the logistical part in the staple world, which is very important for the region, create some uncertainties, which make some countries to react into those. And that was what we faced, some trade restrictions like the quotas that were put both in wheat and also in rice. But today, the level of trade restrictions is very small. It has moved down from 16 countries to 10 countries putting export restrictions. And the share of the global exports is just around 2.5%. So it's very low. On contrary, in 2007 and 8, during the food price crisis, we have around 33 countries putting export restrictions, and these imply close to 30-something% of the global trade growth. So the situation is very different. We don't have a problem of food availability today. The problem is different. So the logistical problems are being smooth, countries are resolving, the vessels are now flowing, but we have a different problem, and that's where we move into the phase 2, what we call the consequences of COVID-19. Why we call the consequences is because the lockdown affected many economic sectors, affected the oil sector, affected the food sector, affected all the production sectors and all the service sectors. And that created a completely stop of the economy. And that has a consequence, which will be a decrease in GDP growth. So the IMF is projecting that the GDP will grow at 3%, minus 3%. And for some regions, it goes up to minus 5.7 to 7%, depending on the region. Now, when we look in detail in the geographical distribution of the regions on the countries which are decreasing and the few countries that still are increasing, most of the countries that are going to be positive are in Africa and in Asia and in South Asia. And we are concerned about it because that not seems to be the reality, especially because of the lowering of the commodity prices, which will affect all the exports of these countries and therefore the capacity to be able to cope with the situation. So our expectation today is that we will be moving into a global decrease of GDP growth of around 5%, and which could expand even more if we go into a second wave of COVID-19. And also we know that 32% of the labor force in food systems, which is around 430 million people in formal jobs in agriculture, are at risk because of COVID-19. And that implies around 1.2 billion livelihoods that could be affected. So the problem is big, the consequences are severe, and the issue is how to respond to those consequences. So what we are looking at is what we call the third phase. And this third phase, we call it health, food, and development. Why? Because although we are moving out of the lockdowns by decree, if we are not careful in terms of the health standards and the health codes that needs to be put in place for the food industry, we could end in lockdowns which are by health reasons and not by decree. And that could put us in a very severe situation. We have already observed that in the meat industry, in the case of the US. We have observed that in wholesale markets and retail markets in Latin America. And we are observing in other regions similar problems. So for us, this trilogy of health, food, and development is crucial. And why development? Because as Vladimir said, we need to find opportunities to the crisis. I think the way we are looking in FAO is, okay, we are in a crisis, but we should look forward. And where are the windows of opportunities where we can do a change, when we can do a difference, that we can resolve a problem that before we couldn't. It will help us in the short term to cope with the recession, but it will also help us in the recovery because it will improve something substantial that we couldn't improve before. So that's how we are looking at. Because we are really concerned that because of the recession, the demand will be reduced significantly in food commodities. And especially, this not necessarily will affect the staple commodities. We don't see too much of an effect in the demand for staple commodities. Even today, China is informing that they will procure a lot of staple commodities. So we don't see the problem there. We see the problem more on high-value commodities and on especially the high-value commodities that come from trees, like fruits, coffee, tea, and so on. Why? Because it's more complex for farmers to change and to adjust to the recession, because a tree takes 3 or 4 years to grow, and I won't be able to change that. A vegetable, I can change how much I'm planting, and I can adjust to what I expect my demand will be. But for the trees, no. And that will imply significant losses and left in the field, and we need to find solutions to that. Second, we are expecting a problem of liquidity for farmers. If they are not able to sell what they harvest, they will face liquidities to be able to implement and plan next season. And that's where we need to be smart. It's not an issue of just putting subsidies in place. I think we can find mechanisms in which we can create guarantee systems, like the central banks can be a guarantor, so that a financial institution can lend to the farmers under, of course, lower interest rates. But those lending could have conditionalities, minimize losses, sell to local markets also, given that the export market will be reduced. But that will help to create the liquidity to assure the planting in the next season. If we don't help in that process, then we could be facing problems because farmers won't be able to plant in the next season. So what are the policies we're looking? The first one is emergency, no? And in emergency, we need to keep giving food assistance and nutrition interventions using safety nets to help the poorest. That's central because that problem has not been resolved, and we cannot have populations in hunger. That could create political problems too. So we need to find ways to expand the safety net mechanisms we have, and to also bring public works programs that could help us to do investments, but at the same give access to resources. Because remember, the problem we are foreseeing is a problem of food access. It's not a problem of food availability. It's a problem of having resources to buy food. Now, school feeding programs have been closed, but we need to find alternatives to those through other mechanisms. And when the schools reopen, we need to reactivate those school feeding programs and even expand them, because that's the way to do it. So we need to find ways to optimize this mechanism. And FAO has some experience in Armenia, for example, working with cash and beneficiaries. Here it's important to understand that we can no longer work with conditionalities of the cash transfer programs, because of the pseudo lockdowns that we will be, it's very difficult to comply with conditionalities. We have to change that. We also need to expand both horizontally, because there will be more hotspots of food insecurity in these countries, but also vertically in terms of the quantity of the transfer. But again, other alternatives like public works programs could solve this, because we will have a lot of people that before have never been in poverty, have never been in problems of lack of food. And today, because they lose their jobs, because of the unemployment that we're going to see increase, they will be moving in a situation that they are not used to, and they don't know how to cope with it. And giving them activities to do through public work programs could be an option. And that's something that we need to carefully think and try to innovate in tools and mechanisms to do that. We are producing several briefs on this, which I hope could be useful for you, but there are ways that we need to cope with this situation, because we cannot afford politically a situation like this. Second, we need to increase food availability from the medium and smallholder farmers, because the large farmers will be able to provide financial liquidity, and they will be able to. Somebody has to lock their mic. Okay. Because the large farmers will be able to get access to liquidity, but the medium and the small will be the ones that will be very constrained in terms of cash availability. And here, the opportunity is to increase productivity and to minimize losses. And how we minimize losses if we have a lower demand because of the recession? There are two ways that we think this could be done: by deploying very efficient storage capacities with cooling and drying facilities that will allow us to cope for a longer period, farmers to cope for a longer period and decide when to sell when we move out of the base of the U of the recovery, but also to adding value to what we are going to produce. So I think it's an opportunity to add value to the product. Like, for example, if we are producing a high value commodity like a fruit, in the local market the price will be very low. They are produced for external markets. But if we add value to that commodity and we create dry fruits of different qualities, and we create product differentiation, that could be possible because it will allow you to cope for a longer period of time and to be able to sell it when markets are better. The trick here, I think where the smartness of the policy is, how I can give instruments to farmers so that they can cope for a longer period of the 12 to 18 months of recession that they're going to face, so that they can not lose all their income and their livelihoods. That's what you want to avoid. So the more instruments we can provide to them are the better. The other, of course, is promote e-commerce in agriculture, which it has happened, it's already happening in the region. But I think we need to bring more of it because it's a mechanism that we know could help and could work. In terms of the cereal production prospects, the harvesting of the winter cereals, mainly wheat, begins in June, while planting cereal crops to be harvested in August is ongoing. Our expectation is that the planting will be the same, and we hope that to happen. That's what we are discussing with the AMIS, the Agricultural Market Information System. Now, the preliminary forecast for 2020 wheat production in the European Union is about 10% below average, which is okay. It's not alarming because of the level of reserves we have and because the supplies on other parts of the world are also positive. And the Russian Federation is expecting a 5% increase above average. So we are not so concerned about this. And other wheat-producing countries, Ukraine, Turkey, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan, the wheat production is forecast near average level. So again, this shows to us that the supply is not an issue. Food availability is there. The problem is a problem of food access. And why is so important the region? Because you play a crucial share of the exports in the region of these basic cereals, and wheat especially. And anything that happens in the production of Russia or the European Union or Ukraine will affect the global markets because they are highly concentrated. You are a key player. You are 1/5 of the, or more than 1/5, you are close to 40% of the global export market of this commodity. So we need to keep them flowing. We need to keep the markets operating to avoid any potential problem in terms of food availability. Now, and that is linked to trade and issues of trade and how we can keep mobility of food and how we can minimize restrictions. And the region has been very active in this. Many countries in the ECA region implemented trade measures with the aim of ensuring adequate domestic food supplies. And we are respectful of this because it's important to understand that when the exchange rate devaluates, the producers and the exporters have all the incentives of the world to push all their grain outside. And working with quotas when they are big enough to assure the international amount of trade that you had before makes sense. Because the only thing you are doing is trying to assure that the amount of food that you need locally is still there without distorting the market. But that's the way we need to sell it to avoid any misinterpretation of the message. But essentially what we are trying to do, saying, okay, we know you producers that the exchange rate gives you a comparative advantage to move the commodity outside. But we need to keep production for internal purposes. And the quota, if it is big enough, there shouldn't be any problem. So Kazakhstan, Russian Federation, Ukraine, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, North Macedonia, and Tajikistan start to work on these type of ideas. And that helped them to be able to have enough grain locally. But the idea is not also to distort the international market because there is no reason why to distort the international market. And especially if you're in a recession, in the future, if you distort the international market, you will be affecting your own producers. And also there were measures to facilitate imports like Kazakhstan, Turkey, and Uzbekistan, and Georgia, and EU did, such as subsidies on imports or exemption and reduction. And as long as these are temporal measures during the period of concern, of uncertainty, which was basically the period where we had some concerns on the logistical part of the vessel transportation. But today, the vessels are operating regularly, so we don't see that problem anymore. There were also non-trade policies in response to COVID-19. Several countries in the region implemented also non-trade policy measures to ensure adequate domestic supplies, like selling grains from state reserves. And here, the more transparent the triggers are for triggering those reserves, the best it will be. And the more you will be protected to any other issue that is not technical in terms of the delivery of reserves. And we have been developing triggers in terms of excessive volatility that you can use and could help to fine-tune the trigger mechanisms you have today. Providing agricultural subsidies and loans and finance, the point here is okay, as long as this is for investment to increase productivity and to gain efficiency. Implementing price controls and market interventions in several countries. And again, there are tools that will allow us to have mechanisms where you keep the market operating, but when the prices trigger certain thresholds, then you put a band. And those are protecting of the market operation. What you want to avoid is more market distortions. And of course, how to support vulnerable populations and supply of loads of food. Now, the absorption of great grain and flour prices in importing countries started because of the significant demand that there was on basically on grains, on wheat, and so on. And that creates some increases in prices, but today this is starting to stabilize and the prices will start to settle again to a situation. And because of the recession, our expectation is that prices will start to fall down. And that's when we start to get concerned because we want our exporters also to be able to get revenues from what they produce. Now, the effects are not the same across the different elements of the supply chain. If we look at the losses of jobs, for example, in the food systems supply chain, most of the losses are on the services part, the packing, the transportation, the selling, the retailer. So we need to look at the value chain and trying to see where the problems are, because that will help us to identify where the liquidity should go. And that is really important. Now, yesterday I was hearing a presentation from the US government, for example, and one thing that they did to resolve the problem of the farmers in terms of losses is that they told the farmers, instead of throwing the food, comply with this regulation, package the food in these boxes and ship it to the food banks so that it can be distributed to the poorest people. And then you receive the resources in compensation. So you can be very smart in the way those policies are implemented. So on one side, you are protecting the farmers so that they don't throw the food and they can get the revenue they need to be able to continue their planting season. But on the other hand, you're using that food, which in alternative ways will have been thrown, to be able to supply to the food banks to distribute to the poorest and most needed people. So those are the types of mechanisms we need to figure out to be able to resolve. Now, on the services side, on the retailer and on the restaurants and so on, there we need to create this e-commerce and this have enough mechanisms of delivery to help them. Now, what we are also seeing is that there will be significant changes in food consumption. And here we need to be worried because we want to minimize any potential effect of increasing overweight and obesity. But IFPRI did this work, and basically they saw reduction in fruits and vegetables, which is important. It's going against a healthy diet, which is what we need, and increases in consumption of maize and other crops. But that's what we need to look at, but also reduction in consumption of white and red meat. So again, we need to look carefully to these consumption patterns and the changes to be able to put policies that will compensate for that so that we are sure the results we're trying to look at. And this is just showing what I was referring before, how certain sectors like the dairy, the baked goods, and the rice post-noodles has been significantly affected, while others have been, the more processed food has been empowered because people were buying food that they could store versus food that is fresh and so on. So that creates different problems across the food value chain. And here is another important thing, is the new formal of enterprises. And the change that we're observing, something that was very low in the region is now very empowered on e-commerce. And that's how we see the shift will be moving. So a slow return to out-of-home eating due to the recession, shift on online grocery will continue, and growth of opportunities for e-commerce will continue, and also for some food categories. And the way we are seeing this is to try to find ways that we can exponentiate the e-commerce in agriculture. Inputs has been a very important issue, especially fertilizers, and your region is a supplier also of fertilizers to the world. So it's really important, and because of the exchange rate, they have a comparative advantage, and the lowering of the prices of oil, then of course transportation costs also go down. And the region needs to take advantage of this, because that's a way to distribute inputs, which are also important. And the logistical problems have affected access to inputs. So that's another value chain that the sector needs to empower. And let me, because I am over the time, let me just finalize on how we are seeing the before and after. So this is the meat industry, for example. The left is the before. The right is the after, today, in the US, for example. That still is not good. As you see, physical distance is not respected, although the plastic bans are trying to protect people. But that's where the triology with health comes in. We need to put more effort to re-engineer in the way in which the packaging and the processing plants in the value chain are designed. And the Nordic countries are progressing significantly on that. Also, we will start moving to automatization, that's for sure. Robotics is getting a huge opportunity, but we need to be prepared because this could create a labor issue. This process was already starting, but was not moving too fast. Now it's accelerated. And here we need to create the skills in the labor force so that new jobs can be created linked to automatization. Also, horizontal farming for vegetables will happen. Vegetables which don't travel too long distances today, they will travel even less distances. Why? Because it's possible to produce locally. It's different to fruits, different to staples where you need huge economies of scale, to meat and so on. But in the case of vegetables, you can produce them locally and closer to the urban areas. And we know horizontal farming, if you have the technical skills, is profitable today. So we need to focus on how to learn and how to create that, because that's what will happen. we will also start moving to automatization in the packaging industry and in the processing. What you see in the left is what is happening today in the Nordic countries. They are already moving into significant automatization. And again, for me, the alert there is jobs, because these are labor-intensive activities today in most of our countries. How we are going to compensate those jobs? And we need to move in parallel, creating new skills so that we can absorb that labor force. And finally, the e-commerce, as I mentioned before, which we need to empower the delivery mechanisms, because it's not just buying through the internet. It's also having the machinery of delivery mechanisms. That's what assured the success in China, for example. It's having the e-money ready, having the electronic way of paying. So that is where I see things moving, and where we need to start doing significant investments so that it happens correctly, and it doesn't create concentration of power and problems of employment. So let's take the opportunity and the advantage to move forward in that direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maximo, for this very comprehensive and fascinating overview for the region. I think it's a good starting point. And let me, in this case, really turn also to the panelists. I've seen there are already some questions coming in from the chat. We will also feed them into the discussion. But I would like to turn to Paulo, and particularly I wanted to move a bit from west to east, taking into consideration that the measures of the lockdown are also lifted a bit first in Western countries, and then we're moving also further to the east. So Paulo, Maximo has in his presentation showed also the impact on food enterprises is not everywhere the same. So also he demonstrated also what are the opportunities. So how would you see from your point of view, the situation for your members? And on one hand, you have farmers, but on the other hand, you have also large cooperatives in various countries of the EU. So how would you see the situation? And particularly from a production processing point of view, where do you see here the difficulties?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, good morning to everyone who is attending this webinar, and in particular, thank you to Maximo Torero for his very good presentation. He has highlighted quite a number of points that are quite significant. What I would like to stress a bit is that among our membership, and we are talking about farmers and agricultural cooperatives from the European Union, we have a differentiated situation. We have seen an impact that, of course, is variable according to the sectors, and we have seen, in particular, significant impacts on dairy, on meats, on flour and plants, fruit and vegetables, wine, olive oil, cereals, oil seeds, potatoes, sugar, just to name a few. And the impact in these sectors was mostly due to the lockdown measures that were imposed and effectively the close of the HoReCa channels. And that has caused, as I said, significant impacts on farmers, and with those channels being completely cut off from one day to the other. The impacts, as I said, are immediate, but the solutions to remediate this, they range from immediate to medium to long term. And of course, you also have to differentiate between what is the impact directly on farmers, on those that produce, and then what is the impact on the cooperatives that group and process and add value to farmers' production. And there again, Maximo pointed out a couple of things that are extremely important. We are, and just coming back to some comments that were made before, in the EU, we are in the process of policy formulation Somebody referred to last week's presentation of the EU biodiversity strategy, of the farm to fork strategy, and even yesterday of the revised multi-annual budget for the Union with a recovery program that is called Next Generation EU. So what we need here, and this is the point that I would like to make at this stage, is in order to try and look a bit more further down the line to secure investments. These investments, and again here we would be talking about a mixture between grants and loans with different maturity periods, but this is what is important for the sector to recover. First of all, for the farmers, and there are sectors that lost more than 80 to 90% of their income, what they were doing from one day to the other. Flowers and plants, for instance, some fruit and veg also. We need to adequately provide these tools for the sector to start looking forward to a recovery. And this also, it's not only for farmers, but also for agricultural cooperatives. When we look at the possibilities to try to identify opportunities further down the line and benefit from that, and to have the necessary funds to be able to invest. Digitalization, automatization was indicated. These are things that are quite important in the long run, especially when you want to move into more sustainable food systems. Let's be clear, we are not starting from zero. We are, and we have been doing something. We can always do better, but it is important to have support, financial support, especially when the sector is hurting from this situation, and to prepare for what's coming up in the future. And here again, a well-functioning single market within the EU is fundamental. We have seen the importance of this. We have seen also the importance of logistics, and how food security sometimes is taken for granted, and it's necessary to look into it. Functioning of food chains is fundamental.
Can I cut
Yes.
again on this one? Because you're touching, of course, certainly on a couple of issues, investment and also the digitalization. I would like to put that a bit more also further down the line. Let's maybe, I would like to turn also to Tugomir as an EU member country. And you heard particularly also now what the private sector in this case is also saying. The EU has in principle strong budgets compared to also some of the other countries. So what are the concrete issues from the Croatian perspective? Croatia had certainly also now the presidency. We do not want to talk about the EU budget, but how do you see that from how you're affected, and how you are going to get the country out of this?
Thank you very much, Raymond. First of all, thank you very much to all presenters, panelists, and Mr. Torreira for excellent presentation. Dear Mr. Rahmanin, Raymond, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure on behalf of Croatian Ministry of Agriculture to participate this conference, and I will refer exactly what you just questioned on some activities made on the level of EU, and on the other hand, on the activities during actual crisis on the level of Croatia. Yes, soon after the restrictive measure because of the COVID-19 epidemics on movement of people and goods were introduced by member states in the second half of March, some disturbances at the market in distribution were visible. The usual supply chains and patterns of consumption changed, definitely. The positive aspect was that no problems in the food security were recorded, but there were fears that food security could become an issue in the long term if decisive and immediate action is not taken. Import was also a concern because restrictions introduced in transport and the food supply chain. As you're aware, this crisis coincided with the Croatian presidency of the Council of the European Union. Thus, the measure related to the market in the context of COVID-19 pandemics became the first priority of our presidency. So already at the beginning of the crisis on March 25th, we have organized the first video conference of EU agriculture and fisheries ministers on the issue. On this issue, who reported on the situation in their countries and suggested measures to help farmers to overcome the difficulties due to the COVID crisis. Croatia, as the presidency, communicated this proposal to the European Commission on behalf of the member states, and this initiative resulted in 3 separate packages of measures proposed and adopted by the Commission. First, enable the member states to provide support in the shape to state aid to their farmers and fishermen at the higher rate and under more flexible rules for implementation. Second package related to the simplification of administration procedure and exception from some mandatory rules. Those included an extension of deadlines for submitting application, exception from the on-the-spot controls, and increasing of the advance payments for the farmers. Also, higher flexibility was enabled in spending of EU funds by transferring unspent funds between different measures. Third package contains common market organization measures for the most affected agricultural sectors. The measures introduced include support for the private storages, more flexible implementation of operational programs of producer organization, and provision on contractual relations in order to better adapt the supply to the market. In the context of lifting lockdowns and challenges that are awaiting the food system in the future, at this moment, under discussion in the EU is a proposal for a new targeted measure for farmers and SMEs.
There's a sound problem.
And SMEs, yes, under the Rural Development Program. The measure will consist of a financial compensation to producers in difficulties due to COVID-19 measures. We hope that the relevant amendments to the Rural Development Regulations will be adopted soon, which will enable the implementation of these new measures. However, many European agricultural ministers pointed out so far that further measures will be needed if the current situation remains, especially in terms of further relaxing the current CAP rules. The proposed additional measures relate to the on-the-spot checks or the increase of the voluntary CAP support, but also provision of additional financing from the EU budget. Activation of the private storage and other market measures for sectors such as poultry, pig meat, veal and potatoes was also requested. The dairy and wine sector will also need additional support. Besides the measures on the EU level, the Croatian government made several packages on our level to help our national economy, and among them in order to reduce the negative impact of crisis. We adopted a support program for primary agricultural producers in the crop production and livestock sector in the value of €7 million. The goal of the program is to maintain employment and the current level of production on small farms in the agricultural sector. We also adopted the decision that aims to simplify the procedure for procurement of agricultural food products for contracting authorities in case of increased demand, when the contracted supplier is unable to deliver additional quantities of agricultural and food products. Through direct ordering using a negotiated procedure without prior publication. Given the numerous difficulties and limitations in the food supply chain, the Ministry of Agriculture has developed so-called digital market where suppliers of agri-food products will be listed, making it easier for contracted authorities to find suppliers. I will not list all the measures, but I want to stress out that finally, and I would like to point out that yesterday was published a new multi-annual financial framework of the European Union. It is important to say that it is planned aggravating financing the common agricultural policy. Then in the last proposed, this was proposal from 2018.
Can I cut you a bit? But just finish quickly. Yeah, but
I will finish in next 1 minute. That means that the Commission recognizes agriculture as one of the crucial sectors in the context of COVID-19, is aware of the problems occurring in the food chain supply in the future, and provide additional financial fund for fulfilling increased requirements set out in the new strategies, Farm to Fork and the biodiversity strategy. I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tugomir. Very good. I think it gives a clear indication and understanding how the situation is in Croatia and what the challenges are, which you, of course, also faced also as a presidency. Let me, in fact, turn now a bit on another country, and this is certainly Ukraine. I hope Taras is still with us. I know that there are some issues and it's some problems, but I would definitely like to hear how the Ukraine, as one of the key export countries in the region and globally, how do you see here the situation, and do you see here also a considerable drop in terms of the demand also for the reduction of the exports? So how do you see how you're going to get out of this? Taras, I cannot see you on the screen. Are you still with us? No, it seems he's not connected. Okay, this is certainly, yeah, he's not. So there seems to be obviously a technical problem, and this is with some of these live streams. Okay, good. Then let me turn in this case to moving from Croatia to the situation, for example, in Armenia. Arman, we have seen, of course, also in the presentation from Maximo, that in Armenia, with maybe also some cash plus programs, the resilience of the farmers seems to be also quite good. But how do you see it? And you have particularly also requested FAO to look a bit more in the greenhouse sector. So this is an area where you definitely also very concerned. And what is the context, and how do you see you are going to be getting out of this?
Thank you, Raymond. Dear distinguished colleagues, thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be in your presence. With the implemented measures for limiting the spread of coronavirus, such as restrictions on the people's movement, introductions for export and import policies, added border control for merchandise, and closure of restaurants, food venues, it have doubtlessly affected agricultural value chains negatively. Specifically, in the end of March and mid-April, the country faced difficulties in reaching foreign markets. Normally, it takes 3 to 5 days by truck to transport fresh fruits and vegetables to the Russian market, but since mid-March, our trucks have arrived in Moscow in 16 to 20 days at best. In the worst scenarios, the freight gets returned to Armenia from Georgian border. As a result, mainly the large greenhouse owners had significant losses. Meanwhile, the depreciation of the ruble doubled the negative effect of the damage to agribusinesses. Naturally, the current situation has affected the country's import-export procedures. The export numbers as of April this year compared to the last year this month have decreased by 30.3%. Meanwhile, look at the export numbers from January through May of 2020, then the decrease amounts to 8.1%. Even though there were difficulties in exporting fresh products, However, within this period of time, we registered a 6.7% rise in the export of plant-based products. The negative impact on import was around 11.5% for the same period of time. Today, the most countries depend on imports more than they did 20 years ago, but even so, the world is currently also on more robust footing and more prepared for disruptions caused by the pandemic. Even though there were disruptions on imported food and supply chains, domestic food prices were fairly stable and food price spikes were not registered, except for grains and pulses, specifically buckwheat, which have experienced a slight increase. A comparative analysis of the retail prices for bread, butter, sugar, flour as of March 2018, 2019, 2020 indicates that in March 2020, the prices of butter and sugar were even lower than in the same period of the previous 2 years. Meanwhile, the prices of bread and flour have either experienced slight increase or have remained at the same level. It is also worth noting that because of some import difficulties, fertilizer price mildly rose in this period. However, at the same time, the price for diesel fuel has decreased, and after making simple calculations, it can easily be observed that the increased price for fertilizers is almost equivalent to the amount saved from the decreased price of the diesel fuel. Hence, the rise and fall of fertilizer and diesel fuel prices are respectively balanced. The government of the Republic of Armenia has acted quickly and has been instrumental in ensuring the provision of 18 stimulus programs and the full execution.
Thank you, Armen, for this, I think, giving a clear indication which direction you're also going. I want to turn, in this case, also to Katya from Georgia, because, I mean, we know Georgia has a huge variety of products which you are producing, very, let's say, also favorable climates, but you're still importing a considerable amount. And so how do you see the situation now after starting to get out of the lockdown?
So first of all, thank you very much once again for organizing the webinar and for the possibility to discuss the current situation in the country, as well as to listen from colleagues so what is going on in different parts of the world. So you absolutely rightly mentioned, Raymond, that we are producing number of products in Georgia, but as well we are importing from different countries, especially when we are talking about the cereals, which is very significant for the food security purposes. We are heavily depending on the import market. And of course, when the world faced the challenge like COVID-19, the government of Georgia started immediately to create the emergency staff under the Prime Minister's control. And we decided, I mean, all the ministries on the ministerial and deputy ministerial level were part of the emergency staff. And we started immediately collect the information, what was going on in our neighboring countries as well as in the world, and to see the trend, what is coming to Georgia as well, because we know that in globalized world, it's not simply possible to lock down and not to have the impact of all the negative or positive aspects, what is going on. So what we did was that besides the fact that we do this routine monitoring for the cereals in the country, we have started daily monitoring of different products, what was the pricing and what was also the stocks of those products. Because right after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as the pandemic, the people started to buy like panically all the foodstuffs, and we wanted to make sure that we have enough stocks in the country to provide food to people. And you know that the period which was coinciding with the pandemic period was very active in terms of agro terms for agricultural activities. And what we did immediately, we declared that there will be no interruptions and no lockdowns regarding agricultural and spring activities, especially in different regions of Georgia. And we immediately declared that all the limitations which will be declared will have some derogations from the general rules. But of course, the rules of the Ministry of Health was the priority. And I would say that this was unprecedented in case of Georgia, when the government, in very close coordination with academia and healthcare sector, elaborated the concrete rules, what must be followed from each and every citizen in Georgia to have effective readiness to the COVID. So the government immediately called all the retailers, logistics, food producers, even farmers and associations who are working closely with farmers and members of the cooperatives, to give them the understanding what was the plan of the government, and also to listen from their side where they see the interaction from the state side will be essential. And based on that, we have created inside the ministry the staff, the emergency staff as well, and collected the information and updated it every day to have clear picture about the ongoing challenges and emerging problems in the country. And we immediately started to react on them and to even plan advance what might happen in the coming days. So, and the biggest challenge, what we identified by that time, was the infected workforces, for example. If the pandemic will, if the virus will spread very fast, the very first target group which will be affected, of course, is the labor force, who are very intensive in agriculture in Georgia, because 39% of the total population is employed in this sector. So, and what we decided to work closely with the Ministry of Healthcare and to start the testing, the aggressive testing. And for this, we of course needed close coordination. We also did very fast identification of those regions where the first cases of the COVID. And unfortunately, I would say that the region which is mostly providing the fresh fruit and vegetables to the entire country, like Marneuli, for example, it was very affected with the coronavirus. And what we did was that we have locked down that region before the lockdown of the whole country, and we established the special control zones and nobody could come and go out of that region. And we established the special quarantine zones in the country also, and everyone who had at least one characteristics of the virus, we transferred those people to these zones, these quarantine zones. And I would say that till now, more than 20,000 people were in quarantine zones, and big part of them already left the zones. But what we did with these actions, we closed the virus in different places. What we did also was that
Kadia, sorry to interrupt. There just came also a question in which I think might be good also to have a quick answer from your side. How do you think at the moment the planting season is really affecting you in the country? Is this something where you would be concerned about, or how is this going to be seen?
As I said, we announced that the planting season should not be interrupted from the government side. We did all the possible interactions with the farmers, not to make obstacles to their activities and not to make some difficulties to their activities. But of course, naturally, because of the restrictions of mobility, for example, and because of the restrictions to work many people together, there was some challenges coming from different farmers. And for them, the difficult situation was that even if they wanted to mobilize more than 10 people to have their agricultural activities, there was a very strict regulations that they were not allowed to do so. There was a limitation that up to 10 people can work together, and it was challenging for them. But for the planting season, we do not see that there will be any problem. In order to support these planting activities and not to stop agricultural season in Georgia, the government considered in its anti-crisis plan support programs for the farmers. And this is, I would say, the first time in the world when nobody is against subsidies, and all the governments in every country, they are like supporting and identifying different forms of the subsidies, how to support farmers. And this was the way also from the government side. Normally, I'm always against the interruption from the government side to the any activities and to the market, to have market distortions. But in this case, it was normal that governments decided to give the assistance, the direct assistance to the farmers. For example, you know that Georgia is a very small country with fragmented agricultural lands. And what we did was that everyone who has the ownership of the land up to starting from 0.25 hectare up to 10 hectares, we gave them 200 Georgian lari per hectare for their agricultural activities. And we gave them, with this, we gave them the possibility to have access to the finances, to the fertilizers, to the herbicides, pesticides, and all the needed materials. Also, we gave them the access to the preferential plowing service. And also what we did was that we have offered them agro-diesel program, which was the first time in Georgia when we assisted farmers with the diesel fuel and for their agricultural activities. And per hectare, it was 150 liters. And everybody can take this assistance who is owing 10 hectares of agricultural land. Also, we have lifted all the amelioration related fees for the farmers, and till the end of this year, it will be free delivery of water, because you know the water is very crucial for the agriculture. Also, who has the agricultural loans from the different state support programs, we decided to subsidize the interest rates for them, and we have negotiated with the banks that farmers will get preferential credits with even more preferential conditions. And also we have made some changes in the existing agro insurance program and gave farmers the possibility to have
money. Can I interrupt you a bit in this one, because also a bit of the time. I think one of the key points which we certainly also need to take into consideration, and I've seen there were also some questions on this one, how probably also the foreign direct investment is going to be affected by the COVID to the different countries. And let me in that sense turn with this to also Taras Kachka. I think you're back. And so we would also certainly like to hear from the Ukraine what in this case are the issues, and particularly how you see this, how to get out of it, and how are the perspectives in the future in that sense. So Taras, are you now with us? I can see you on the screen, but I do not.
So
okay, now
here I am. Hello. Here I am. Excuse me that I have in parallel a meeting on fertilizers, and our farmers are actually trying to express their position on our attempt to also to regulate the market of fertilizers. But so that's why it's so difficult to, should be better. So I think that our approach is to, first of all, to coordinate internal policy between all stakeholders, and ensure stability in trade, in regional trade. So the big positive lessons learned from our shutdown is that in order to succeed, in order to ensure food security, you need to have daily coordination between all stakeholders. And the challenges of availability of products, on price stability, and also the usual activity of farmers, because the spring is the most important season in the year for farmers. So all this was managed only due to proactive activity of government. We used all platforms to communicate with associations, with businesses directly, and I think that we succeeded in this. So that's why I'm a little bit disappointed to talk diplomatically that in Mario presentation in Ukraine was included in the list of states which limited export of cereals. We never did this, and I think that I will object quite strongly that on any statements of this kind, because this is one of our biggest success, that we never actually intervened into export of cereals. The only measure we took was connected with buckwheat, and it was a reaction on absolutely unjustified limitation of export of buckwheat from Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. So I think that coordination between government and agricultural, all agricultural stakeholders is the best scenario for managing and mitigating all risks connected with coronavirus. And I think that the means we have, the memorandum of understanding between government and market, is the best tool of coordinating activities. And now, for example, we reached the maximum agreed volume of export, and we have record export of wheat, for example. And we know that there is no necessity to introduce any administrative measure, because we know that traders are switching to the wheat of new harvest. So that's why I think that one of biggest success for Ukraine in coronavirus was and is the maintaining of our operation in agriculture as close to normal situation as possible. So now we see that the volume of land which was so that the harvesting season is going really in normal way. We have no obstacles in importation or exportations of any inputs, and we have really good coordination with all our exporters and in terms of food security. The only, I think, the key challenges here are of informational kind. We were really strongly, so we were surprised by the sudden decision of Romania, for example, to block export in absolutely, which is undermine the rules of the European Union as our key trade partners. For us, it was a couple of days of total uncertainty, because we really rely on EU rules when we trade with the European Union. So that's why we were glad that Romania cancelled the decision on blocking of export. And but at the same time, in Black Sea region, I think that the activities of governments in intervening in international trade is also influencing other states which do not intervene into states. And since we are regional and the prices actually influence, or we influence each other in terms of price and in terms of assessment. So that's why I think that the better coordination between states in the region is possible. The next biggest challenge, second biggest challenge, is of course the temptation of national producers to use COVID-19 situation for protectionism. This temptation exists everywhere, both in Ukraine and the European Union. And for us, I think that what is worrisome is that sometimes the positions in neighboring states in the European Union, for example, this temptation and this request for nationalism are oriented against Ukraine, And for us, what we are trying to do in our dialogue with the European Union is to ensure that that we need open trade for the benefit of domestic industry as well. So, and especially in the areas like agriculture, where Ukraine sells approximately 15 million tons of corn to the European Union, feeding animals in European agriculture. So it's like like industrial cooperation almost. And that's why we were quite negatively surprised by the statements of Kopa Kazeka on a non-increase in the trade with Ukraine. So it's extremely negative signal from the EU to us, and we are trying to convince our neighbors that we need to maintain our open trade and to develop it, because we really believe that open and predictable trade is a key source for development of agriculture.
Taras, can I take just in this case one of the points you mentioned, and putting this maybe a bit also more in the global context, and because we are talking about protectionism, but on the other hand, we have also questions also here from the audience who says, are we going to focus more on local production? So let me ask maybe Maximo, what do you think? Are we going to see an increase of protectionism around the world from also the smaller ones and the bigger one? Are there already any views from your side? And the other question, which comes also from the floor, what do you think is the focus on local production and consumption? Is this also going to be a trend? Maximo? I'm not sure if Maximo, are you still with us? Well, okay. Okay, good. Then I will. Are you still? We can hear and we can see you. Are you with us?
Hi, I am sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Now it's okay.
Please, can you repeat me the question?
Yeah. So the two questions, which in principle I had, based also what Taras was also saying, that maybe there is a danger, and do we see a trend in terms of protectionism coming out of COVID globally? And the second one is, how do you see also the focus more on local production and consumption in the midterm, and in parallel investing also in storages and other logistic facilities? So how do you see this? Where do we need to go, and what do we see already globally?
Yes, so look, in terms of the local production, I think that we need to be very careful. What will be produced locally, as I mentioned, more will be vegetables, because that is feasible to do. There is technology to do it through controlled environments, but also because it's something that is more easier to produce relative to fruits and to other types of high value commodities like coffee and so on, which needs other types of climates and so on. So that's what will get closer. I think it will be a mistake for us to look at self-sufficiency for many reasons. One, you don't have the comparative advantages to do that. Second, natural resources. There is differences across the world of availability of natural resources. And third, it will be impossible for a country to have all the diversity of diets they need to keep healthy. Now, in terms of protectionism policies, the hope and what we are seeing is that there is more cooperation among countries, and that's what we need to keep enforcing. Because, as I said, the problem is not an issue of food availability. The problem is an issue of food access, and that's where we need to focus. Back to you.
Thanks. In this case, maybe Armen and also Tugomir, picking up on this question, how do you see the trend in your countries, and which policies we are going to go now? Are we going to have very strong emphasis on the policies of local production, strengthening the resilience, in this case, of the farmers? Tugomir, what do you see Croatia is going to do in that sense?
Yes, exactly. Our goal for next period is to strengthening our local production to target strategic sector or strategic products and to increase self-sufficiency. And together with EU and national budget to definitely increase productivity and self-sufficient in some of the sector. Based on new wave of digitalization, new wave of innovation, and of course to absorb more EU funds. Nevertheless, we are very successful on it. Young farmers is our target too, and land management, of course, because we have some gap in usable and arable land, available land in Croatia, and we will definitely strategically target on these issues in the future.
Armin, how do you see this from the Armenian side, local production? I mean, you have large amount of land which is unutilized. How are you going to bring this into production?
So I think that economic stimulus in all countries must be focused on keeping the food supply chains functioning, while also protecting access to locally, regionally, and globally produced food. Stimulus measures that tackle the current menace to food access should emphasize efforts to build resilience into food systems to safeguard them against future economic slowdowns and downturns. We forecasted 46 million tons of wheat surplus within the countries of the Eurasian Economic Union together. Meanwhile, there is an 8 million ton deficit of fresh and processed fruits and berries, and a 1.38 million ton deficit of vegetables. Armenia is self-sufficient with fresh fruits and vegetables, so we will try to increase our share in these markets as well. To contribute the further development of the sector, it is crucially important to use all export opportunities among economic entities and to organize distribution networks as well as to draft market diversification policy. Currently, Armenia is considering to strengthen its air cargo capacities, targeting new export markets and distribution channels. I think that recovery within the food system is not only about revenue. Recovery is about maintaining cooperation and interconnection to avert the worst of COVID-19. And the ongoing survival and growth is driven by an ability to adapt to a changing environment. Thank you.
Katja, how do you see it in the Georgian case? You do not have such large amounts of unutilized land, but of course also this could be also further stimulated. And is this something where you put a strong emphasis on?
Actually, what we see more is that to increase the productivity of the agricultural production, what we have in Georgia, because as you rightly mentioned, we do not have that much unutilized lands in different regions. But what we see as an opportunity is also that increased productivity in the sector and mobilizing also the fruits and vegetables in a way that to not to have the lack and gap in supply chain. And also I want to mention here the price system as well, because as you know, within the limited imports in the country, the prices of the local productions was quite high, and the farmers got quite good incomes for their products. And also we are supporting the different programs to increase the capacity of storage facilities and wholesale markets in the country. And also we are supporting them to have the better market linkages. What we did was that for the farmers, especially for the smallholders, whose distribution channels were mainly the local touristic destinations like HoReCa sector, for example, in the country. We help them to establish the market linkages with big supermarket chains in the country. And we think that in this right policies, what we are now implementing and using the challenges as the opportunities in the country, we will have in the coming months, we will have better results. And we are also working on the post-crisis plan. And of course, we will be more concentrated on the increased capacity of local production, as well as utilizing the maximum potential of those products of Georgia, which has competitive advantages in different markets.
Maximo mentioned in the presentation also towards the end, and I think this is also for all of the countries, let's say the opportunities also of automation. And in this case, I want to turn also back to Paulo, but then taking also the time into consideration, maybe one or quick statement from the others. How do you see the issue of automation? Is this something which is going to get a boost based on the COVID implication, Paulo?
Well, digitalization and further development of IT tools is something that is fundamental to improve the competitiveness of the sector. So taking also into consideration the policy formulation that is in preparation at the level of the EU, this is something that we have called for. But this is not only in terms of IT tools, it's also in terms of other tools like new genomic techniques that are fundamental to improve the competitiveness of the sector. Because when we talk about being more sustainable, we need to look into the three main aspects of it: the environment, the economic, and the social. And if we are to do more for the environment, we need to have alternatives to the current situation. And both these aspects that I just mentioned are clearly elements for it. And of course, automatization of practices, of features, both in the field in terms of production, both and also on cooperative side in terms of processing, transformation, etc., are fundamental for all of this.
I guess the issue in this case is automatization means investment budgets, and here of course probably EU country like Tugomir, you're in a better position with having also the EU support in the back. How do you see here automation is something which going to get a boost for Croatian meat or Croatian food industry?
Yes, definitely. As I already mentioned, digitalization in agriculture is very needed, and in our draft of new strategy for agriculture and rural development, we definitely stress that we will rely on new techniques, new technologies, and based on innovation in agriculture, we are planning to boost our production and definitely our productivity on our farms and on our fields.
Armen, how do you see e-commerce or automatization for Armenia? I mean, the food industry is still relatively small. So what do you see are there opportunities?
So what we see globally, it is that the markets are transforming and consumer behavior is changing. So we need to follow all these developments. And currently, together with our colleagues from FAO, we initiated development of agriculture strategy. We think that we are not going to electronic agriculture, but we will more go for intelligent agriculture and trying to bring all these transformations and the know-how to this e-commerce and electronic expressions.
Very good. Thank you also, Armin. I see, unfortunately, the time is up for this, let's say, interesting also webinar. I think there is much more also to talk about. We were not really able to touch on all of the aspects which I think are important for the future. But in this case, I can definitely say there is more to come. It's one of the starting points of the webinar. So we are in a position to take some of the specific issues for the region. Also in future webinars, there will be one coming week on the second one, which looks particularly also in extension and in this case of agriculture information, but also smallholders are going to come. So with this, I would like to thank you all, particularly distinguished panelists and colleagues on the screen for this interesting debate and discussion. And in this case, I would like to give the last sentence back to also Vladimir, and then we are going to close. Vladimir, back to you.
Thank you very much, Raymond, and thank you all the panelists and all the people who attended and asked the questions. Not all of them were answered, but I can assure you that all of them are taken on board, and we'll be looking into them and either providing answers or using it in our work. I want to express my gratitude to Raymond and his colleagues for moderating this discussion. None of us has a crystal ball. We are trying to figure out how to live in that. The advantage of FAO and our regional office is that we are collecting all the best practices. We have specialists with the global experiences, and we try to adjust it to our region and to bring it to your attention. We are also neutral and technical. That's why we want everybody to participate in this discussion. And in the future, we shall try to attract also European Union, Turkey, Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, big producers, which were mentioned in today's discussion. So everybody should be attending. Also, what I learned that there are a few new issues related to COVID-19, but this crisis actually focused us more on the issues that were always with us. And they are just not exhaustively and not in specific order, but they're exactly innovation. How to use this innovation, and it's robotics, it's meteorology, it's information technologies. It's definitely, everybody is talking about trade integration and market information, and this is MS and other things that we can contribute. It's definitely food standards, which would be used in the trade and in other things. It's livestock production, which we did not talk about yet. It's disaster resilience, because in our region, in addition to COVID, we have locusts, we have droughts, and we have floods. So all these issues we need to look into, and all your inputs, and of course, nutrition. Also very important issue that we need to look into. So very much appreciated the contribution of all the panelists, the experiences of Croatia, Armenia, Georgia, and Ukraine are very important, and we are looking forward to your further contributions, expanding our geographic horizons, as well as deepening our substance. Thank you very much. I sincerely appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. And with this, we're going to close, and we're looking forward to see the audience both on YouTube and here on the Zoom also next week for the next round. Thank you very much, and all the best, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.